So I wanted, before we get started, to let everyone know that I have a new podcast out, and it's called Meditations. If you like the Meditations segment of this current podcast, you'll like the Meditations podcast. It's nothing but 20 minutes of meditative sounds. And now, on with the podcast.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
My wife's a twin. I remember the first time I saw my wife, I was in New York City at this party. I remember the moment she walked in, the door opened, and she was so beautiful, so stunning, she just lit up the entire room. Well, it was either her or her sister. I don't know.
Good morning. It's Friday, Evil Friday, May the 16th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the headlines, patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, and the marketing of evil. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now the headlines for Friday, May the 16th. House GOP targets another Dem official accused of blocking ICE amid Delaney Hall fallout. The FBI is leaving the Hoover building because it's unsafe for our workforce, reveals FBI Director Cash to Fox. Federal Judge Matthew J. Kaczmarek rules that the 1964 Civil Rights Act does not mandate employers to use an employee's preferred pronouns or allow access to restrooms or locker rooms based on gender identity. The left lacks any aspirational vision for America. Congressmen build special soundproof girl Congress next door so the men can get some work done. Jordan Hudson absent from Bill Belichick's Good Morning America interview after CBS fiasco. Missing Georgia camper miraculously found alive after disappearing for weeks in California wilderness. And those are the headlines for Friday, May the 16th. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the political corner.
So Donnie, the deal maker, just secured a major win for the United States. Donald Trump just signed a massive $600 billion deal with Saudi Arabia and expecting them to sign over another $400 billion in the next few months. So if you guys remember, Israel or Benjamin Netanyahu was throwing a fit because Donald Trump was securing a major deal in Saudi Arabia. And this is like, it's an oil deal this time around, right? And they're expecting to continue this partnership or build and continue this partnership for the next 10 years. And this has nothing to do with the $400 billion that he committed to investing into AI back when Donald Trump just took office. So since Donald Trump took office, Saudi Arabia alone have committed to invest over a 10-year period $1.4 trillion.
And that was the political corner. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Patriotic Short.
What would happen if the U.S. military tried to take Canada today? Canada's response would change everything. Let me explain. First, American ground forces and tanks, supported by bases along the border, would unleash a massive invasion into southern Canada through the world's longest undefended border. Predicting this, Canada might mobilize its military reserves and air force, but due to the overwhelming size difference and American air superiority, the impact would likely not change anything. The U.S. Air Force would take out military bases and airports, paving the way for rounds of strikes on command centers, supply routes, and troop positions. But an aerial strategy alone wouldn't be enough. To fully take control, the U.S. would face a huge problem. Canada is the second largest country in the world. They could focus on taking the major cities first, except they still have huge risks. However, once in Canadian territory, just the distance between cities would make things difficult. Taking control of where most Canadians live could require a force of approximately 2 million troops.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, I need to get motivated.
One change, that one sacrifice, you would stop dreaming and start living it.
It's very, very simple to get what you want, but it's not easy. It's your job to make yourself do the crap you don't want to do so you can be everything that you're supposed to be. And you're so damn busy waiting to feel like it. And you're never going to. Ever. No one's coming. No one. No one's coming to push you. No one's coming to tell you to turn the TV off. No one's coming to tell you to get out the door and exercise. Nobody's coming to tell you to apply for that job that you've always dreamt about. Nobody's coming to write the business plan for you. It's up to you. And because you're only ever going to do the things that you feel like doing right now or that feel good right now, unless you understand that you've got to parent yourself, you've got to push yourself, you're not going to make your dreams come true.
If you want to live your best life, your absolutely best life, you got to do me a huge favor. You got to watch them choices, baby. People make bad choices. They wake up and they make another bad choice. They make another bad choice. Now they got a habit of bad choices, right? And they like, how did I get here? Choices. How did I get here? You trying to get to certain places, but you ain't making the choices that's going to get you there. You all in your feelings. The problem is that most people, they can't get up in the morning. They ain't got no energy. They don't got the energy to keep up with me. I'm like, boo, ain't nothing wrong with you. You just ain't got the stamina. You just ain't got the energy. You can't smart everything. You can't outthink everything. Some stuff is just, you got to be powerful. It's just some stuff that you got to have stamina for. You just too slow. It just take you too long. You wake up, take you 3 weeks to do what it can take 24 hours to do. It don't make you a bad person, but you're going to forever be average because to be great, you got to keep up.
The people in life that win play offense, not defense. Stop backing into everything. Stand up. Bow your back a little bit. Start to walk a little different. Start to be that best version of you. You can do it in your quiet way. You can do it the way you do it. But somehow they got to look at you and go, okay, I won't monkey with that one. You push back. You get obsessed. You got to get relentless. You got to be a road dog. You got to get intense. You got to have a permeating attitude that you're going to win. You got to have a positive outlook. You got to be optimistic. You got to know you're going to win. You got to, right now, you got to say, I'm going to win. I'm going to win. My life is going to win. There's going to be a victorious life here. Because listen to me, the price you pay for losing here is too extreme. You have to carry the burden of failure the rest of your life.
As we begin to elevate ourselves and not to follow the crowd, activating the thinker in us and disciplining and putting on hold the emotional part of ourselves. It's not easy, but through practice and practice and practice, practice makes improvement. You can always better your best. You can always go beyond anything that you have ever done. You'll never hit a state of perfection. You're always bigger than what you do. And so all you're looking for are new breakthroughs through practice and practice and practice. You'll get better and better and better. Something you should affirm to yourself every day. Repeat this, please. No matter how bad it is or how bad it gets, I'm going to make it. The people that make it in this world look around for the circumstances that they want, and if they can't find them, they create them. It's hard. No, easy is not an option. However, ladies and gentlemen, what you will discover is that it's worth it. It takes guts. You got to dig down deep to gut it out. Keep on going again and again and again until you make it happen, because you know that it's possible, and you are the determining factor.
And there you go. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, meditate, meditate, meditate. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Stoic.
Nothing to fear but fear itself. But there is no reason to live and no limit to our miseries if we let our fears predominate. Seneca, Moral Letters, 13.12b. In the early days of what would become known as the Great Depression, a new president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in and gave his first inaugural address. As the last president to hold office before the 20th Amendment was ratified, FDR wasn't able to take office until March, meaning that the country had been without strong leadership for months. Panic was in the air, banks were failing, and people were scared. You've probably heard the nothing to fear but fear itself soundbite that FDR gave in that famous speech. But the full line is worth reading, because it applies to many difficult things we face in life. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. The Stoics knew that fear was to be feared because of the miseries it creates. The things we fear pale in comparison to the damage we do to ourselves and others when we unthinkingly scramble to avoid them. An economic depression is bad. A panic is worse. A tough situation isn't helped by terror. It only makes things harder. And that's why we must resist it and reject it if we wish to turn this situation around.
And that was the Daily Stoic. And now, The Exorcist.
Because demons can put that perspective on the images in your imagination. They can manipulate and control you emotionally by the perspective that they put on that. This is one of the reasons why they spend enormous amounts of time getting you to follow your emotions. Because if they can get you to follow your emotions, all they have to do is move your emotions by putting this perspective on, and then they can control you. That's exactly what has happened in our culture for 50 straight years. They've been training us, they've been habituating us to follow our emotions. You can't watch 5 minutes of the news media without there being some bleeding heart story to get you, oh, and the next one's, oh, because you're afraid. And the next one is, it's just a constant stream of emotions. And they're getting people to follow that. They even tell, well, if you don't follow your emotions, you're just heartless. No, I'm a human being. Okay, and so that habituation that we're seeing actually going on is how they manipulate and control us. So that's the same with things that demons actually do, but as our culture becomes more and more like that, it means that demons become more empowered because following your emotions over reason is disordered.
And that was The Exorcist. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, America's abundance was not created by public sacrifices to the common good, but by the productive genius of free men who pursued their own personal interests and the making of their own private fortunes. Unquote. And that was Ayn Rand from the chapter, What is Capitalism? From the book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a commercial, and it illustrates very well the very sophisticated form of gaslighting that goes on these days.
Hey there, Brenda.
It's Carol.
Exactly. So which leg are we operating on?
You mean arm?
It's all connected.
Asking the right question can greatly impact your future.
Are you sure you're an orthopedist?
Actually, I'm a Sagittarius.
So there you go. This is the sophisticated form of gaslighting, which he pretends, first of all, refuses to acknowledge any mistakes. You'll notice this particularly from Democrats and particularly political Democrats, people on Capitol Hill that don't want to admit that they've made a mistake. They don't want to admit that they're wrong. So they simply pretend they either don't understand what you're saying or that they don't speak English. And again, this is a sophisticated form of gaslighting. These people aren't necessarily narcissists or have any type of psychological problems or issues. They're not necessarily psychotic or severely neurotic. Many of the gaslighting books and literature that you're going to come across treat it as though it's some kind of a psychological problem, when in reality, gaslighting is a series of tools and techniques that can be used by anybody and is used by just about everybody. So if you listen carefully to politicians, pundits, and probably even the people you come in contact with on a daily basis, you'll hear this type of gaslighting. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stewie.
Yeah, that's what we put you in office to do.
Jason Smith said they have $1.5 trillion in cuts. All right, everybody, have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Varney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Hey, good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. The president is on his way home. Air Force One is due to fly to England to refuel. Trump has teased about going to an undisclosed destination, maybe for a high-level meeting. We shall see. As he left the Mideast, the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, was lit up in red, white, and blue as a mark of respect for America. He's bringing back trillions of dollars for the U.S. economy, and he's projected an image of strength that goes down well in the Arabian Gulf. It may be the best week of his second term so far. Separately, the president says there will be no progress on the Ukraine war until he and Putin sit down together. Let's go to the markets. We're on modest rally mode. The Dow could be up about just shy of 100 points. Nasdaq up about 30. S&P up 10. But there's green on that screen. Bitcoin priced now around $103. Interest rates, they are easing a little. Maybe that's helping the market. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is well below 4.5%. You're at 4.40. And the 2-year well below 4%. You're at 3.95. Politics. There are serious, unresolved differences among Republicans trying to get a budget deal. They're fighting about spending, SALT, work requirements for Medicaid. The Budget Committee meets today. There's concern they won't get a deal done anytime soon. The markets would not like that. On the show today, what was he thinking? James Comey says he found shells on a beach, marking out 8647. He posted the picture, then took it down. President Trump says everyone knows what 8647 means. He says it's a call for assassination. Bruce Springsteen insults the president frequently during a concert in Britain. He called Trump corrupt, incompetent, and treacherous. You know, it just looks bad when an aging rock star trashes the president who's on a very successful trip overseas. And New Jersey, Springsteen's home state, not in good shape. Today, there's a transit strike affecting 300,000 commuters. All this week, Newark has been at the center of airport chaos. Democrats in the state are desperately trying to stop the deportation of criminal migrants. That is not popular. In fact, Trump has a much higher approval rating in New Jersey than the governor, Phil Murphy. That's the way it is. It is Friday, May 16th, 2025.
And Stuart Varney's, all the stories he just named right now, Fox has decided to go with because it will make them profits. Non-profit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, what does the phrase, if you're explaining, you're losing, mean? This was said by Ronald Reagan, speaking of political campaigns. From the perspective of your audience, if you have to explain yourself, you come off looking desperate to convince. As a consequence, you lose the high ground. From a more philosophical perspective, if you have a clear conscience and strong conviction towards the positions you take, your values, truth, and direction, you don't need the opinions or consent of others. As a consequence, you don't need to explain yourself. However, if you yourself are not convinced of the validity and truth of your position, or you can't fully justify your choices, then you continue to expel words, in an attempt to create the illusion of certainty. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from a book that's called Good Inside. What's the opposite of understanding? For this argument's sake, it's convincing. Convincing is the attempt to prove a singular reality, to prove that only one thing is true. Convincing is an attempt to be right, and as a result make the other person wrong. It rests on the assumption that there's only one correct viewpoint. And then my question is this supposed to be convincing? Further, convincing has one goal in mind, being right. And here's the unfortunate consequence of being right. The other person feels unseen and unheard, at which point most people become infuriated and combative, because it feels as if the other person does not accept your realness or worth. Feeling unseen and unheard makes connection impossible. Understanding two things are true and convincing one thing is true are diametrically opposed ways of approaching other people, so a powerful first step in any interaction is to notice which mode you're in. When you're in one thing is true mode, you're judgmental of and reactive to someone else's experience because it feels like an assault on your own truth. As a result, you will seek to prove your own point of view, which in turn makes the other person defensive because they need to uphold the realness of their experience. In one thing is true mode, exchanges escalate quickly. Each person thinks they're arguing about the content of the conversation when in fact they're trying to defend that they are a real, worthy person with a real, truthful experience. And again, is this convincing? Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the marketing of evil.
Chapter 2. Buying the Big Lie, the myth of church-state separation. "Get your hands off our God," shouted one indignant protester. Others, urging him to stay calm, knelt on the ground and prayed. Still other demonstrators took to chanting, "Put it back! Put it back! Put it back!" Prominent national voices wailed in indignation. Dismayed Americans unleashed a fusillade of letters, faxes, and emails to politicians and newspapers and each other. Evangelical leader Dr. James Dobson, who had urged his millions of radio listeners to head to Montgomery, Alabama in a show of support, fervently warned that America was witnessing a campaign to remove every vestige of faith or reverence for God from the public square. But all the agonized protests were to no avail. The spectacular 5,300-pound monument of the Ten Commandments, installed in the courthouse's rotunda by then Alabama Supreme Court Chief Justice Roy Moore, was being kicked out. It took little more than an hour for 3 workers and a security guard to hoist the washing machine-sized granite cube onto a dolly and scoot it out of sight of television cameras to an undisclosed location and out of public view. To top off the spectacle, Moore was then suspended from his position as the state's top jurist for defying the mandate of U.S. District Judge Myron Thompson, who had ordered the monument's removal. Exactly why, you might ask, did the Ten Commandments, the spiritual basis for America's laws, which are also carved into the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., have to be banished from the Alabama Judicial Building? Well, you see, Judge Thompson had determined that the monument violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Congress shall make no law. Thompson never explained how a granite display of the Ten Commandments in a courthouse equaled Congress making a law. But that didn't matter. Somehow, though most Americans are repulsed by it, a virulent and increasingly pervasive legal theory of the First Amendment holds that Christmas manger scenes must be eliminated from public places, commencement exercises conducted without a prayer, and kids must refrain from saying Merry Christmas at school. How far, millions wonder, can this judicial assault on the nation's religious and traditional values possibly go before someone stops it? The truth is, the notion of the constitutional separation of church and state that underlies all these cases, and indeed that underlies the legal transformation of America into a de facto atheistic secular state, is a lie. It is one of the truly outrageous, malignant, and provably false big lies of our generation. Think back. If you attended public school in the last few decades, you probably remember being taught that America was founded by a lively assortment of slave-holding Christians, deists, and freethinkers who insisted on instituting a constitutional separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson, you were reminded, had famously affirmed this wall of separation in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists. You could be forgiven for inferring from all this education that, back in the good old days at least, government scrupulously kept religion at arm's length. But that would be truly deluded. In reality, throughout the late 1700s, the era of the Revolutionary War and the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, Christianity permeated America from top to bottom. For example, in 1777, with the Revolutionary War threatening the flow of Bibles from England, Congress approved the purchase of 20,000 Bibles from Holland to give to the states. No fewer than 6 of the 13 original states had official state-supported churches, establishments of religion. I'll bet you didn't know that. In fact, these states, Connecticut, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, refused to ratify the new national constitution unless it included a prohibition of federal meddling with their existing state establishments of religion. Other states required those seeking elected office to be Christians. The Continental Congress routinely designated days of fasting and prayer and other religious observances, appointed government-funded chaplains, and appropriated money to pay for Christian missionaries to convert the Indians. In other words, the original American government under the Constitution would have driven the American Civil Liberties Union stark, raving mad. What a difference 200 years can make. Here's what's happening in U.S. courts today. A federal court ruled that a school teacher couldn't be seen in school with his own personal Bible, and later ruled that a classroom library containing 237 books must remove the 2 titles dealing with Christianity. A criminal, convicted and sentenced by a jury for brutally clubbing to death a 71-year-old woman with an axe handle so he could steal her Social Security check, had his sentence overturned. Why? The prosecuting attorney, in a statement lasting less than 5 seconds, mentioned a Bible verse in the courtroom. A federal court ruled that a public cemetery couldn't have a planter in the shape of a cross, since the mere sight of it could cause emotional distress to a passerby and thus constitute injury in fact. Injury in fact from looking at a planter? Isn't it about time we face the painful truth that we Americans have had our Constitution, and therefore the very reins of power, stolen from us while we were busy going to work, raising our kids, paying the bills, and watching Jeopardy? Here's a real quick civics lesson. The section of the Constitution that deals with religion is the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. The first 16 words of it, anyway. There's the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And there's the Free Exercise Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Establishment Clause, that's the one today's courts almost always focus on, simply prohibits the federal government from establishing a national church or from interfering with the established churches of the states. Remember, several states already had state-supported establishments of religion. Possibly you wonder whether the issue is really this cut and dried. After all, for the last half-century, judicial activists on the Supreme Court and lower courts, ACLU lawyers, the press, and the secular culture in general have embraced the constitutional separation of church and state as though it actually existed somewhere in the Constitution. Of course, none of these words, separation, church, or state, are in the First Amendment. Do you really believe the Founding Fathers wanted to make kids into criminals for saying Merry Christmas at school? Did they intend for the Supreme Court to outlaw prayer in the nation's learning institutions when all of their own congressional sessions to this very day open with a prayer? Of course not. Joseph Story was appointed by President James Madison to the Supreme Court in 1811, where he served for the next 33 years until his death. He explained exactly how the High Court regarded the First Amendment in his celebrated Commentary on the Constitution of the United States. Here's what he said. Probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and of the amendment to it now under consideration, the First Amendment, the general, if not the universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state as far as was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. For the next 150 years or so, America's judiciary interpreted the First Amendment as the founders intended it, that is, prohibiting the establishment of a single national denomination. Court rulings and public policies reflected that common understanding. But then, halfway through the last century, something happened that changed all that. This something first showed its face in 1947 in the Supreme Court case Everson versus Board of Education. Speaking for the majority, Justice Hugo Black announced a new and previously unknown legal principle. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. Ever since then, the High Court's rulings have relentlessly aimed at removing every vestige of Christian language, imagery, and symbolism from public property. From the decisions of the 1960s outlawing prayer and religious instruction in schools to today's surreal court battles over whether it's okay for school kids to pledge allegiance under God, today's judiciary interprets the First Amendment in a radically different way than did all its predecessors. You might well wonder, how can these judges, sworn to uphold the Constitution, violate their oaths of office, betray the trust of current and future generations of Americans, and usurp power that's not legally theirs? Don't they realize what they're doing? Understand that, despite what you may have been led to believe, it's a simple task to ascertain the original meaning of any part of the Constitution or its amendments. The Constitution is not long, mystical, and transcendent like the Bible, open to all sorts of conflicting interpretations. Rather, it is a short, clear, relatively recent English-language contract that was written for the average person. Its original intent is an open book and therefore beyond rational dispute. But let me tell you a story that may illustrate how judges, sworn to uphold the Constitution, can nevertheless render grotesque decisions totally contrary to the Constitution. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote the majority opinion in perhaps the most controversial Supreme Court decision in history, Roe v. Wade, which divided the right to abortion from the 14th Amendment's supposed right to privacy, when there simply is no mention of any right to privacy in the 14th Amendment or anywhere else in the Constitution. In March 2004, when Blackmun's private papers were finally released to the public decades after the momentous 1973 Roe decision, his daughter, Sally Blackmun, revealed something remarkable. Talking to Women's E-News, she disclosed for the first time that her father consulted with members of his family after being assigned responsibility for writing the majority opinion on Roe v. Wade. Roe was a case that Dad struggled with, Blackmun told the Feminist News Service. It was a case that he asked his daughter's and his wife's opinion about. Most pertinent among those opinions would have been Sally's. 7 years before Roe v. Wade, while she was a 19-year-old sophomore at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York, Sally Blackmun discovered she was pregnant. It was one of those things I was not at all proud of, that I was not at all pleased with myself about, she said. It was a big disappointment to my parents. I did what so many young women of my era did. I quit college and married my 20-year-old college boyfriend. It was a decision that I might have made differently had Roe versus Wade been around. Shortly after the wedding, Sally Blackman lost her child to a miscarriage. Although it took 6 years to complete her graduation requirements, she questions whether she would have graduated at all had her child been born. Getting pregnant had caused a major dent in the life she had planned. In those same 6 years, her hastily formed marriage collapsed. By then it was 1972, the same year her father sought her input on Roe. Although Supreme Court decisions are generally made without advance announcement, Justice Blackmun notified his daughter so she could be present when the decision was read. I remember that it was very tense in the courtroom, very crowded, she said. The decorum is such that people aren't yelling and screaming and carrying on. We didn't know how he was going to come down on it, and I was very pleased with the decision and the fact that it gave women that right of choice, recalled Sally Blackmun. Dad always felt it was the right thing to do and the necessary thing to do toward the full emancipation of women in this country, so we certainly were in favor of what he did. Okay, the obvious question. Did Justice Blackmun's passion for championing abortion rights have anything at all to do with his daughter's out-of-wedlock pregnancy experience and the pain, embarrassment, and trauma it caused the Blackmun family? Do we need to guess what sort of advice that Sally, who later became an attorney and chairwoman of Planned Parenthood of Greater Orlando, might have given her father? And is this how a Supreme Court decision, especially one responsible for more than 1 million abortions every year for 3 decades, is supposed to be made? Is this what we've come to? Judges make rulings based on their personal whims, emotions, and family traumas, oblivious to the fact that they're changing the course of history in profound and destructive ways? How do we get from having justices like Joseph Story, who reverenced the Constitution and honored the intent and wisdom of the founders, to justices like Blackmun? Do you really want to know what happened in the mid-20th century that caused the Supreme Court to lose its prior allegiance to higher principles? The answer is as obvious as it is unsettling. America as a whole was drifting away from its prior allegiance to higher principles. How could the Supreme Court crank out its revolutionary 1962 ruling outlawing school prayer and its 1963 decision banning Bible reading and religious instruction in the nation's schools? Just look at what was going on in America at the same time. The cover of the April 8, 1966 issue of Time magazine, perhaps its most controversial edition ever, said it all. On the black background, giant red letters trumpeted the scandalous question, "Is God dead?" Surveying the confusion and uncertainty of mainstream Christianity during the 1960s, Time reporter John T. Elson wrote, "There is an acute feeling that the churches on Sunday are preaching the existence of a God who is nowhere visible in their daily lives. Leader after religious leader expressed doubt and confusion about the faith of their fathers. Even Francis B. Sayre, the Episcopal Dean of Washington's famed National Cathedral, admitted, 'I'm confused as to what God is, but so is the rest of America.' Lutheran church historian Martin Marty told the Time reporter that all too many pews were filled on Sunday with practical atheists, disguised non-believers who behaved during the rest of the week as if God did not exist. Theologian Langdon Gilkey said, 'Belief is the area in the modern Protestant church where one finds blankness, silence, people not knowing what to say, or merely repeating what their preachers say.' The magazine said that, in search of meaning, some believers desperately turned to psychiatry, Zen, or drugs. Thousands of others quietly abandoned all but token allegiance to the churches, surrendering themselves to a life of anonymous Christianity, dedicated to civil rights or the Peace Corps. And philosopher Michael Novak of Stanford, speaking for a generation of young Roman Catholics for whom the dogmas of the church have lost much of their power, said, 'I do not understand God, nor the way in which he works. If occasionally I raise my heart in prayer, it is to no God I can see or hear or feel. It is to a God in as cold and obscure a polar night as any non-believer has known.' Whoa! With shepherds like this, no wonder the 1960s flock was scattered and befuddled. No wonder Eastern and cultic religious movements, from transcendental meditation to Hare Krishna, flourished and proliferated. And no wonder government, especially the judiciary, became intoxicated with the idea that it could create a more perfect world by enlarging its scope and power. There was a spiritual vacuum in America, and government, as it always does, came whooshing in to fill it. Faith was out as a basis for governing our lives or country. In light of this zeitgeist among America's elite, and believe me, Supreme Court justices live among the elite, is it any wonder that genuine respect for a Constitution and Bill of Rights that were largely the result of a Christian worldview would drastically diminish? Wouldn't this seismic shift in worldviews, with its worship of scientific progress and dismissive attitude toward traditional faith, fit perfectly with the notion at the heart of all judicial activism, namely that the Constitution is a living, breathing, and therefore changing document? But wait, you might say, times do change. The world has been radically transformed by technology. We don't keep slaves anymore. So what's wrong with regarding the Constitution as a living, breathing document? Of course, the Constitution can be changed through the amendment process, as it has 17 times since the adoption of the first 10 amendments. We called it Bill of Rights. But the idea of a living Constitution is very different. It means the contract between America and its government is to be interpreted anew by each generation. Here's the problem. Although our technology, knowledge base, and culture have all changed dramatically over the centuries, human nature and human character weaknesses haven't changed a bit. The universal appeals to personal pride, ambition, greed, lust, envy, power haven't changed. Thus, the need for strictly constitutional government with clearly defined and limited powers is still necessary, because despite our advances, absolute power still corrupts absolutely. Unfortunately, in today's America, the judiciary has assumed something approaching absolute power. Far too many judges see themselves not as humble servants and guardians of a sacred 200-plus-year-old contract between Americans and the government they created, but rather as high priests of a new order, chosen to chart the path of civilization in a new, more enlightened globalist world. Of course, the illogic of all this is that if the Constitution, meant to be the standard by which we measure all other laws, can be changed on the whim of the current court, then we really have no Constitution. You're probably wondering, since the Supreme Court's supposed wall between church and state obviously exists nowhere in the Constitution or Bill of Rights, why does everyone seem to pretend it does? In today's judicial culture, the First Amendment and religion clauses have been mysteriously overshadowed by the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, 8 words taken out of context from an incidental letter President Thomas Jefferson wrote to constituents in 1802. And yet, the constitutional separation of church and state is a phrase that rolls off the tongues of judges and journalists so easily and so often that most Americans assume it's in the Constitution. But as all marketers well know, there's a method to constant repetition. As the famous American philosopher William James put it, there is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. Indeed, there are very few phrases more familiar to Americans than the separation of church and state. Marketers pay millions to brand their product or make their political candidate a household name. But just as with commercial or political marketing, widespread familiarity with the slogan doesn't necessarily mean the message is true. Former Chief Justice William Rehnquist nailed it when he said, "The metaphor of a wall of separation is bad history and worse law. It has made a positive chaos out of court rulings. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned." In other words, it's a big lie. Such lies self-destruct when examined closely, such as the notion that the Constitution is a living document. Let's look at it. The opposite of a living document is a dead document, and who wants that? Living and breathing are positive-sounding attributes, but if you told your spouse that your marriage contract is a living, breathing document, and therefore you should be able to have intimate relationships with other partners, would your spouse approve? I don't think so. Why not? Because it's a lie. The truly living quality of any contract, including the Constitution, is its integrity, its unchanging nature, just like a marriage contract. What kills a contract are attempts to change, twist, or reinterpret it. So, in reality, the secularist living Constitution is dead, while the same document, interpreted according to its original intent, is full of life and value. Common sense provides ample proof that the First Amendment's religion clauses couldn't possibly mean what the ACLU and some judges say they mean, since there is simply no evidence of it in history. Think about it. It's the first and most important right enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and yet there are no examples of this modern, radical, anti-Christian interpretation being applied during our nation's first 150 years. When we allow the First Amendment to be radically changed from its original meaning to what it has become today, the prohibition of any acknowledgement of God or his laws inside the schools where most of our children spend their youth, or within the government we entrust with leading us, do you realize what we're doing? We are deluding ourselves into believing there is some neutral zone between good and evil, and that this is where government and public education are supposed to exist and operate. But such a neutral zone, if such can even be said to exist, is in itself evil. When Jews are being gassed and cremated down the street, neutrality is not neutral, it's collaboration. When we realize the Creator has stationed us on this earth in a battleground between a good kingdom and an evil one, and that our only real choice in life is between obedience to divine love or disobedience, between honesty and dishonesty, nobility and shallowness, courage and cowardice, we can see there really is no neutral ground. What we're witnessing today is the official, ever so gradual squeezing out of everything that's really precious to America. It's as though we're throwing away something so valuable that it goes beyond the ability of words to convey. We're taking the finest life has to offer, like the most precious memories of our children, of their birth, of their accomplishments, and we're taking the sacrifices of our soldiers, of our patriots, our nation's martyrs, and we're junking them. Think of the Puritans who braved the 2-month sea voyage to an unknown land and lost half of their number during that first brutal winter. And the loyal patriot soldiers with George Washington at Valley Forge, shivering shoeless and miserable in the snow. Think of the deaths and sufferings of the millions of Americans lost or maimed in war during the last 2 centuries. Ponder as well the tremendous sacrifices of their families. Now think of the sustaining role God, faith, prayer, and the Bible had in the lives of all these people. Our Constitution was conceived, written, believed in, fought for, and died for overwhelmingly by Christians and God-fearing people. If we now believe that same Constitution requires that the Christian faith be taken out of government, then there's really no hope for us as a nation. But I don't think we've all bought that big lie. Yes, we have a lot of judges who offer pious lip service to the Constitution while really believing this 200-plus-year-old document drafted by a bunch of flawed slaveholders is in dire need of major updating by bright, gifted jurists such as themselves. But then there are those like Judge Roy Moore. Standing on the courthouse steps as his beloved 10 Commandments monument was being dragged away, he commented, "It is a sad day in our country when the moral foundation of our laws and the acknowledgement of God has to be hidden from public view to appease a federal judge." Focus on the Family's James Dobson summed it all up. Decrying the judicial banishment of the 10 Commandments as part of a movement to remove every trace of faith or reverence for God from the public square, he warned, "We're at a pivotal point in the history of this country." He added, "Be a participant. Don't sit on the sidelines while our basic freedoms are lost."
And so that was Chapter 2 of The Marketing of Evil, How Radicals, Elitists, and Pseudo-Experts Sell Us Corruption Disguised as Freedom. And it's by David Kaplan. And it's read by the author. But the problem here is with the whole chapter is he is trying to prove a negative. And you can't do that. It's impossible to prove a negative. The left uses this tactic all the time. They'll make an arbitrary claim in order to bait the right into proving a negative, proving that something isn't the way they say it is. They'll say, separation of church and state. And they'll say it as though they'll say it with confidence. And that baits the right into saying, no, there is no such thing as separation of church and state. And he spent this whole chapter, and other people have spent chapters and chapters and hundreds and thousands of words trying to prove that the separation of church and state doesn't exist. Don't be fooled. The way you handle an arbitrary claim can and should is by making a counter arbitrary claim. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.